All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today in our webinar, which is all about teaching and learning with a focus on equity tools. Before we begin, just want to say Happy Veterans Day. We want to take this opportunity to honor military veterans for their patriotism, love of country, and just willingness to serve. And we thank you for your service. So happy Veterans Day. During our conversation today, if you have any questions, please include that in the Q&A box and we will be happy to answer those at the end of our conversation. Last month, CESI released a playbook called Teaching and Learning within a Guided Pathways Framework. In the report, we highlight that when faculty are aware that their college is implementing guided pathways, their perceptions about if their students or their behaviors about how it's being reflected are very notable because it's higher levels of engagement when they know their college is implementing guided pathways. To accompany this playbook, we included other resources for you, such as a searchable database that includes video clips, narratives, which have descriptions of how community college faculty are implementing various components of teaching and learning, ensure students are learning, which is the pillar 4 of the Guided Pathways framework. We also have a section, which is my favorite, it's on equity tools, which include briefs and spotlight series of documents that explore equity-centered practices that college professionals can use to ensure students are learning. And those tools were developed by a good friend of the center and her team, and that's Dr. Ebony Zamani Gallagher. And obviously, her team has done a wonderful job doing these equity tools. Ebony is the director of the Office for Community College Research and Leadership, and she's a professor of higher education and community college leadership at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So, Ebony, thank you for joining us today. We're really excited to learn about these tools and especially share with our participants today how they can use those tools. Before we start getting the conversation with you, I just want to do a quick exercise. And this exercise was submitted from a faculty member, which is in our database that I just shared with you earlier. So I'm going to share some clues with you about an oppressed group. And I want you to think who this group is. I'm going to share the clues. I'm not going to ask you to share that with us verbally, but just think about it. So here are the clues. There are people who are part of this group who are still forcefully converted to the dominant group. The second clue is in American history, there was a time when people in this group were considered mentally ill. The third one is stereotypes of this group include that these individuals were dirty and clumsy. And then the last clue is if you were a member of this group during the Salem witch trials, this would have been proof that you were a witch. So those are 4 clues of this group. So I want to give you 5 seconds to think about who this oppressed group is. Do you have an idea? Are you ready for the answer? Well, here it is. The oppressed group described here, they are left-handed people. Now, those who are right-handed, I want you to think about the ways in which left-handed people experience just oppression. Some examples include the desk, where they can rest their arm. Think about the scissors, how the scissors are constructed to hold, with your hand. Think about the spiral notebooks. In this exercise that the instructor submitted to us, again, which is in our database, this instructor asked additional questions to her students, such as, how often have you thought about a privilege associated being right-handed? Think about how this privilege is similar to other privileged positions taken for granted, such as being wealthy, such as being in a dominant group. So these are just examples of how she gets the conversation started about oppression, about the inequities. Again, I encourage you to go to our website to look at more examples. So let's go ahead and start the conversation with Ebony. And Ebony, before we start diving into these equity tools, I want the viewers to know a little bit more about you and your background. Let's talk about your research, which focuses on equity issues. You have focused a lot of your research on diverse student populations, especially how they access post-secondary education, how they move in, through, and out. Tell us a little bit more about you. What motivated you to focus on these research topics?
Oh, sure. Linda, thanks again for the invitation to spend some time with you and your network today. And I think that, the question about what motivated me, I believe is to some extent folks refer to as me search in many ways. When I was first introduced to this field in terms of community college research and issues was 25 years ago. No, actually, it was 30 years or so ago at this point. And what was most interesting to me is I felt this affirmation of seen. And so I guess the through line as it
Mhm.
relates to equity issues for me is I've never been very tolerant of group of folk of what irrespective of walk of life not being in a full fold of participation. That's inequitable. And I have also not been one to be comfortable with marginality. And so I think, yeah, it was 25 years ago. It was 1995 when I was first introduced. And so that's been the through line of my work is, you know, um, attracted to community colleges because they so often had been at the margins of the discourse within the field and have sought to do the most with the least for those that are the most marginalized in society. And so whether it's, um, you know, student veterans, students of color, and working class, low income students, former foster youth, LGBTQIA youth. Again, the through line for me is marginality and having students centered, not from the margins, but from a place of mattering.
So, Ebony, in this work that we've been doing and the work I know you've been doing too, I'm sure you hear from faculty the need for professional development opportunities for here. How do we have these conversations, or how do I implement this in the classroom? What does it look like if we do that? So, the center conducted focus groups of over 200 community college faculty, and I want to share a couple of clips with our viewers today on what faculty say about the importance of professional development. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
In our college, we didn't receive any cultural training, but we have a committee, multicultural committee, and I'm a member of that committee. So we discuss in that what can we do to serve different students from different cultural groups. What can we do?
I can't think of a formal training that we've had. I teach about intercultural communication. I try to learn more about it on my own. I try to let the students bring in their own examples. A lot of times we learn from each other in the classroom because we get to talk about that. But as far as an actual training, I think that's probably something my college is developing, but I haven't been part of one recently.
Well, I'm not sure if it's as an institution or if it's more just my status level as an adjunct. Really, any training I want, I need to go out and find. There's lots of opportunities, but there's never required trainings for me. So, yes, if I go to a conference, recently I went to a workshop that was about privilege. So that was, very eye opening, especially some of the videos that they showed.
So let me go ahead and stop sharing my screen. And I hope you heard what they had to say. So we know that it's an it's essential to have these conversations with our faculty, with our staff. And so, Ebony, to help these conversations, your team created these fantastic, awesome equity briefs. Now, let me mention the titles to our audience today, what those are. So, the first one is Asset Based Equity Minded Approaches to Teaching and Learning. The second one is centering equity mindedness in syllabus construction. The third one is the importance of mid-level leaders in advancing equity. And the fourth one is equity-minded approaches for cultivating student engagement in the classroom. So let's go over each one of these tools so our viewers can have an understanding of what it is and how they can implement it. So starting with the first one, and that's asset-based, equity-minded approaches to teaching and learning. There was a quote there, Ebony, that resonated with us at the center, and I want to read this out loud, which said, racially minoritized students are expected to cross cultural borders daily with instructors who do not acknowledge or understand their culture and have little to no critical awareness of their own personal cultural grounding relative to whiteness, white privilege, and so forth. So, Ebony, what does it look like in action to be equity minded?
That's a great question, Linda. I think there's no shortage of research that's been devoted to equity in higher education. Scholars have examined topics that, are specific to race, ethnic stratification, and college access. There's been work that's looked at, income inequalities and degree attainment, gender disparities in college majors, you name it. And so I think that part of the tension is that having equity-minded acts is getting to a first place of what do we mean by equity, and there being some level setting around equity. We know higher education's role is to advance educational opportunities and social mobility, but at the same time, there has been a maintenance of status quo, and one which is undergird and perpetuates, white privilege. And one way that privilege can continue to permeate is by being unexamined. And our faculties, whether it's K-12 educators, community colleges, four-year institutions, are robustly white. And so roughly 4 out of 5 faculty in higher ed are white. And so much of what we've talked about with equity-centered reforms and initiatives, at the foremost of that has been to work with community college practitioners around equity consciousness. And so when you say what is equity in action, that's really about how do you move beyond kind of a simple awareness of inequity to acknowledging specific institutional practices, which includes your classroom, right, that then contribute to these inequities. So equity in action also is when you are actively fostering an equity culture, right? And so equity mindedness can't exist in and of itself. It requires something more than just theory. It has to be that theory to practice. It has to be more than just the right rhetoric, but right sizing the realities through our action steps, right? So that we can have an equity culture that embeds culturally responsive, conscious initiatives, right? And so as we talk to faculty and your work with faculty, our efforts collaboratively have been, and these conversations of how do we help folks to purposefully center their perspectives, consider and be reflective of their belief systems, as well as the organizational, institutional structures and practices that can best advance educational opportunities both in and out of the classroom in terms of the exchange of teaching and learning to ensure that all students learn. And so that ultimately those outcomes for students in terms of those that have been underserved and underrepresented are more equitable.
So moving on to that second brief that your team did, and that's centering equity mindedness in syllabus construction. And this was a favorite one of mine because how do we reflect this in a syllabus? Here's another quote in that brief, and it says, the syllabus is a guide for the course and a contract between instructors and the student that dictate how students are evaluated. Equity-minded syllabi are also race conscious and hyper-aware of the harm that can be and often is inflicted on students of color by race-neutral classroom policies and practices. So
Mhm.
tell us a little bit more about this, especially some of the examples of what an equity-minded syllabus should look like.
Right. So, that level setting I was talking about, despite
Hmm.
how ubiquitous equity is, it again has not been clearly defined, and particularly among faculties, right? And so some people will resist, kind of defining equity in favor of something that's more fluid, something more dynamic and pluralistic and understanding in terms of their approaches with how they develop their courses. Others take, equity to be in my course. I talk about diverse matters, or I have diverse assignments, or the way in which I evaluate students is not just one size fits all, right? And so there's lots of different variation in terms of how people are interpreting that. But when we talk about, developing the equity syllabus, it's really how do you engage in this faceted approach, right? It's this notion that our students have and will attribute different meanings to what our intended purposes are as the educators, right? And so, how to create a class setting, and that the syllabus is that social contract with which students first interact with us and engage, assess the tone for the climate within the classroom and the climate for learning outcomes, as well as equitable experiences in our courses and programs of study. So it's that intentionality piece I think you were just touching upon, where for faculty, equity minded syllabus is that they are purposefully focused on committing to being equitable, not just in the design of the course, um, but how they employ culturally responsive pedagogical practices in teaching and learning, making sure that they're culturally relevant materials embedded in the course, how you create an environment that is informed and guided by practices whereby the learners are recognizing, respecting, and understanding the benefits of each other's diverse lived
Hmm.
experiences while in the course. So there's a way in which I guess we are presenting this as an invitation to become hyper aware, as you
Hmm.
mentioned in that quote, of being equity conscious and
Hmm.
not being color evasive, well, within our being equity minded.
Hmm. So I'm sure some, and this is just a question to what you're just saying. So I'm sure a lot of instructors have reached out to your team to ask for some guidance about how to do this. And I'm sure there's been some eye-opening sharings that they've informed you about, like, oh, I never consider it to do it in this manner, or my students are now really embracing how my course is maybe redesigned because you are bringing this to their attention. So let's
Yeah.
go ahead.
No, I was going to say, yeah, I think that um, folks have also, there's a way in which our intentions don't exempt us from impact. And so,
Hmm.
unless we're activating voluntarily, wanting to be aware and to attend to these matters, whether it's implicit bias or other examples, it holds us accountable as the instructional core when we seek to engage in equity mindedness in the courses.
Absolutely. Let's go on to the next brief, and that's the importance of mid-level leaders in advancing equity, which it focus on the critical role of the department chair with addressing the racism, implicit racial bias that's occurring. And I encourage everybody here who is listening to the webinar to really look at this case study. I mean, look at all of them, but the case study here is very thought provoking. And so, I mean, tell us why it's so important for department chairs. Why are they in a unique position to lead and help others become more aware of their implicit bias?
Right. I think with department chairs, that is what we consider mid-level. leaders in some regards, depending on the organization. But I think when we think of equity-minded change leadership, that it requires folks that are advocates for addressing inequities in terms of the experiences and the outcomes of diverse students, and namely students of color, racially minoritized students that have been systematically failed, if you will, with education in terms of different tiers of the educational pipeline. And so the reason why we felt it important and why we were happy that you gave us the charge to problematize and provide some context and think through like what the unique position is of department chairs, is that this is that part of leadership that we look at as most stable in many regards. Many times there's an institutional stability there when compared to kind of C-suite in terms of maybe the presidency. The average tenure is not as long as folks that will occupy a department chair role. So we see that as the first line workers, if you will. Right? So that first line support folk in terms of our leaders that are doing the necessary racial equity work. So that it's within our community colleges that is that tier of our leadership that is really poised to help us improve, as well as build capacity and skill, and to really take the temperature on what is our bandwidth. As we look across not just at a course level or a program level, but across units, what we need in terms of equity-minded transformative change.
Mhm. And so the next brief that you and your team did was equity-minded approaches for cultivating student engagement in the classroom. And we all know that the classroom is just a critical component of the college experience, and especially at the community college. Usually the engagement happens in the classroom because students, they come to the college, they leave, and so as they have other priorities, where they have to go pick up their children, they're just in and out quite a bit. So it's so critical to engage them in the classroom. The brief mentions that equity-minded educators engage students by creating a classroom environment that's filled with trust and openness. They create an engaging experience by being intentional and mindful and building relationships. And they also create a sense of belonging. And here's another quote that I just want to share with the audience that resonated with us. The quote is, "If we don't know who our students are on an individual level, we won't understand what engagement might look like for that student." And at the center in our national reports, there's a thread that goes on through all these 20 plus national reports, and it's about, that sense of belonging. It's about relationships. Students want to feel connected. Students want to share their story one time. They want to be known. They want to be seen. They want to be heard. So Ebony, let's connect this to the Guided Pathways work. Tell us why this is so important in this national movement, this redesign of what we do to help students move forward to succeed.
Right. It's so important in that, when we think about us as educators, that we have to accept the responsibility, right, for student success, that the onus and the buck just can't be, placed with the students. And so as individuals accept student success as their responsibility, then they're more willing to do what it takes to ensure that all students are learning, particularly those from disadvantaged racial ethnic backgrounds. And so when we think about kind of the interface of Guided Pathways with that, the extent to which students are being on a path, that we're able to help them get on the path, stay on the path, matriculate to completion, but in a manner in which they are engaged, and that the learning in all of those courses and subsequently the program of study has content that is also relevant in terms of culturally relevant materials and content that they can engage with in meaningful ways, because that in and of itself can aid in the retention of keeping students from taking the off ramp in many cases. Right now, that more than ever, particularly as we're facing multiple pandemics, because of COVID and the health crisis,
Mhm.
racial unrest, the racial crisis, economic decline and crisis, leadership and climate concerns, that we need equity-minded educators more than ever. And so the extent to which we have that, that also means that there's a means of influencing
Mhm.
other educators, our colleagues, to adopt similar ideologies relative to thinking about how we construct new knowledge, and how do we build on the ways in which we've previously known can work and apply. And as there have been promising results from guided pathways in terms of student persistence to completion, that we still though have to do digger dives in terms of root causes around applying that to um, the equitable experiences and learning outcomes relative to how students are navigating, because we're not necessarily seeing the needle move as readily
Mhm.
in terms of closing some of those gaps. So I think that as we consider guided pathways as one particular approach and a tool, has lots of utility for many learners, that there are ways in which we want to supplement, augment, if not under pin that with some equity-minded approach, and doing so in a way too that gets beyond just the disaggregation of data. I think that the word is out on that, but there's
Mhm.
more to the data story than just that, right? You and I've had some conversations previously with regard to that. So apply that and have it to benefit students. Again, not just with this pillar for ensuring students learn with what's happening in the classroom, but the transferability of that beyond the four walls, or full walls, if you will, of classroom.
Right. In addition to the conversation that you just mentioned right now, I'm also reminded of some of the work that CCRC does, about equity mindedness. And they encourage colleges to look at which programs, how are they feeding their students in certain types of programs. And so they released a publication. I'm not too sure it was true recently, but they talk about that. Are we having conversations with these students about specific programs beyond what they may be thinking? Because we're more likely to see certain subgroups of students in particular programs. And so they talk about those equity minded approaches. But another thing that I was reminded too, and it's just something on a personal level, I think about where I come from and then this conversation about equity. And I'll tell you this, when I graduated high school, I come from a population that's 95% Hispanic, and when I left, it was very eye-opening to me. And when I left to go to college, I'll never forget this feeling. And I just kept on thinking when I was there at college, the college that I went to, I just kept on thinking, these folks are the same age as me, but why do they know so much more? And why have they talk about things that I'm not aware of. They talk about these resources. And I'm thinking, there's a disconnect here. What's going on? And so now that I'm in this conversation about equity, the inequities of what students experience, now that was an aha moment for me. Backgrounds are different, resources that
Oh, yeah.
students have access to, and how that prepares them for the future. Because when I went to college, I was thinking, I'm not prepared, but I should be prepared because I was on the top of my high school class. But
Mhm.
what's going on here? And these students are succeeding and they're getting it, but I'm not, and I'm struggling. So I was also reminded of that just hearing you speak on a personal level. So I just want to
Yes.
I want to take a moment to pause. And if you have anything, Evan, to add to that while we take a moment to pause, but I wanted Coral to jump in just to see if there's any questions from our viewers.
Linda. Hi, Ebony. It's been a great experience working with you and
Hey,
your team on these equity
ditto.
tools.
Hey, Cora.
If you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the question and answer. It says Q&A at the bottom. So far, we don't have any questions. I'm happy to ask some questions, or if y'all want to continue, whatever you would like
Yeah,
to.
go ahead and ask some questions. Mhm.
All
I
right,
was
Cora.
thinking about the topic you were just talking about with being equity minded. And for those instructors who may be adjuncts, because so many of our students are taught by adjunct instructors, and they're looking to design exams that are equity minded. Ebony, what
Mhm.
suggestions would you have for them?
Well, in terms of exams that are equity minded, I think again, much of it is the onus is on instructors. And, it is unfortunate that you might say, well, I got to reinvent the wheel, but it's not where there's actually a lot out there in the way of, equitable assessments of learning. One thing that is a good resource that folks can tap into is NAOLA, which is it's the National Institute of Learning Outcomes assessment. They have some really great tools that I think folks would particularly useful in terms of models for asset-based teaching. And so not just asset-based teaching, but thinking about equity-minded assessments that faculty, whether they're contingent faculty or not, can really kind of on, what are some of the characteristics of equity-minded assessment, as well as when I'm, creating an assignment or an activity, what kind of meaningful student involvement and engagement is there? How do I help students to explore whether it's in and out of the classroom, some alignment with practices that, again, are engaged in ensure that the materials utilized are culturally relevant, as well as we call culturally sustaining pedagogies, right? So in our house is where, again, from an asset-based approach, how as a faculty member am I building a relationship with my students? Am I really seeking to understand the students in a manner in terms of think about linguistics, as kind of competencies in terms of my own cultural congruency and competencies with that of the students, right? And so those are some of the ways where it comes from an individual to, again, kind of institutional and system levels where people can create change and have what we would describe as, small efforts, but nonetheless redesign, of what can be the student experience in a manner that's more equitable and then fosters more equitable learning outcomes.
And we have another question. This one was submitted by Catherine, and it's a question specific to the briefs and how to use the briefs. And her question is, how do you see administrators and academic leaders using these briefs to pull faculty in as critical on-the-ground equity leaders? How can programming or outreach be planned that becomes actionable for faculty members?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm sure Linda have something to say about this as well, but I think that, and again, the charge given to us was to create what would be portable and succinct, but accessible but information rich resources in terms of the snapshots as well as the briefs, and the ways in which that people can utilize these is as you have staff or faculty meetings to create spaces, to take space and call a thing in terms of talking through what is the representation within your programs of study in particular areas. Think about how your context matters. Have conversations around what has been notably the learning outcomes, but also what is desirable for your unit with regard to that. So I think tools give an invitation for reflective practice, and for people to consider taking a deeper dive, to do some self work as well around, their own cultural awareness, unpacking inequities.
And also, in addition to what Ebony just shared, on our website, and I'm going to put this in the chat box. We have agenda examples, and here, let me put this in the, well, can I put in the chat box? Let's see, here it is. You'll see if you wanted to implement some type of professional development at your campus, here is a drafted agenda. You're going to click on the link, and it'll provide some objectives. It'll ask folks to, let's talk about guided pathways. What does equity mindedness mean to you? Looking at some activities on how to have these conversations, such as think, pair, and share. And there's links there for folks to review, to discuss, and to share their feedback. So if you click on that link, those are some agenda examples. And we'll be happy to send those out to after this webinar.
One other thought too, in addition to what Linda shared, is that there is kind of a bonus brief of sorts, what we call brief 5 loosely, but it's actually a supplemental guide for each of the 4 briefs in the 4 areas that CESI charged us with taking a deeper dive around equity-minded approaches. Can then look to that final 5th brief and ED and faculty meetings and the like. There are reflection and discussion questions. There's also additional resources in terms of suggested readings as well that correspond with each of the standalone briefs. So that would be something that would already be fun for you to go ahead and encourage conversation and action.
And Courtney just put the links to the agenda in the chat.
Great.
We received another question from Ed Leach, who's Executive Director of the National Institute for Staff and Organizational Development. And his question is, what are your thoughts regarding faculty, administrators, and staff being evaluated on meeting racial equity goals? I'll turn that.
I'm sorry, Coral, you broke off for me.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I'll turn that over.
I didn't get the last part.
So the question was, what are your thoughts regarding faculty, administrators, and staff being evaluated on meeting racial equity goals?
I guess it depends on when you say goals, what exactly does that entail? Because I think that there's that's variable. And so it's not uncommon, and it's becoming, it's not widespread, but it's not uncommon that there is a way in which for promotion and tenure that faculty have to demonstrate the extent to which they have sought to be culturally responsive in their pedagogy, right? So what is it that you've done intentionally around how you've crafted this course and how you're assessing student learning, the extent to which, people are engaged in work that broadens participation, speaks to underrepresented, underserved groups. So that is more, it's not commonplace, but it's uncommon. There's still ways in which the norm is people are off the hook. So the extent to which you see kind of broad-ranging ways in which faculty would have to consider and think about a diversity statement, or what their positionality is, or the extent to which they are actively interrogating their curriculum beyond, what is the traditional canon. It's just not that commonplace. But it's something that when we about the realities of our changing demography and who are learning, the fact that our faculty, staff, and administrators in terms of diversity has very much not kept pace with that of those that are at the door sills of our schools and colleges. I think that is something that increasingly needs to be addressed, that and that there should be accountability for it.
Yeah, and let me just add that what Ebony was saying, which also I'm also reminded. So NCII by Rob Johnstone, he and his team created these equity tools to help with conversations like that. It's just not to assess, but how do you start that culture? How do you bring those conversations? And he had two presidents write about these and their briefs, and they're on his website. And one the titles are "Leading Cultural Change to Promote Equity: Perspective from a White CEO," and then the other one is "Perspective from a CEO of Color." So before we start assessing goals, how do you change the culture to lead to that?
We have another question that came in. It's from Primrose, and it's similar to about buying in and changing the culture at your college. How does one get employees to buy in? Do you make this mandatory or optional? Ebony, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, the thing about buy-in or something being required versus optional is, historically, traditionally, as well as currently, American institutions haven't voluntarily sought diversity. And it wasn't until there was a mandate that there was a requirement where institutions or organizations had to be policed into doing so that it actually happened. So I think that there's going to be contingents that require what's the value proposition, or I don't know how to create buy-in per se, but I guess my take on it is that if someone is about the student being centered and the holistic development of students and learners, and wanting to make sure that we don't do a one size fits all, or the equivalent of what I would call an all approach to education, but to have again ways in which we're being intentional, because equity really is this process involved in achieving what the ultimate goal is, which is equality. And equity in education is, how do we provide our students with varied and additional and differentiated supports that are needed in order to achieve equality, right? And so, into which we talk about buy-in, everyone should, again, in terms of base level, want to have and needs to have some awareness of levels of equity and inequity that's present in their own behaviors and institutional behaviors and policies and settings in your organization, and the outcomes that are coming. So, again, a place to start is asking, how mindful and aware are your staff, are your faculty, are your administrators about unequal opportunities that exist for students, and who are those students? When you get into the processes of, how they affect students by particular subpopulations, and then conversations around, again, how are you supporting students, or how you might utilize your data to adjust support services by student need. All of that is being equity minded. But then the next step is beyond equity mindedness, which again is a perspective or mode of thinking that people would exhibit. Again, that's the buy-in part that I think you're mentioning. So you have the equity minded piece, but that's only calling attention to patterns of inequity. It's the so what, now what, right? So then the equity consciousness is about being equity change or equity oriented change agent, and embedded in the definition of equity mindedness. I think a lot of people have away from, in terms of Estella Ben-Simone's work, provide framing for all of this, is core to it is race consciousness. But I think a lot of people are talking about being equity minded, and it's divorced from, where they have a commitment to diversity or want to ensure equity, but they can't face race.
And I think, Cora, we have another question from an anonymous attendee.
We do. A participant submitted a question, and Ebony, I'm sure you've had this before, where there is a professional development opportunity to talk about equity, and some of the folks just want to talk about the great things that are going on at the college, but how do they get to the deeper, richer conversation about changing things related to equity at their college? So if you could focus on getting in that tough, deep conversation where people are vulnerable and they're sharing their experiences, how would you suggest that a college does that?
Right. And I think that still is really very much tied to the previous question, you know, where the question was about buy-in. I see those two bearing some overlap, right, in terms of the questions, because it's hard to engage in these dialogues. Folks aren't necessarily willing to do the necessary homework and in terms of facilitating their own reflection, encouraging that of themselves and their colleagues, as well as wanting to, it also presents a place with which I could see the discomfort where one could render yourself vulnerable of sorts, right? To have these conversations, because if we're going to really be equity conscious and create equity in our colleges, then we got to also think about not just validating the good stuff and rubber stamping, you know, what they, you know, that question that was posed talked about, can we just talk about all the stuff we're doing great? But that we got to have the difficult dialogues. And even though they're hard talks, they're necessary, right? Conversations to be had. So yeah, we want to seek to validate those good things, but we also got to actively acknowledge, you know, our areas and gaps where we want to expose and reveal. And some of it for some people is really lifting the veil on some things that's unseen, that they just, you know, so that there's Dorinda Carter Andrews at Michigan State she talks a lot about what is a consciousness gap in education. And this diversity imperative is kind of a case in point of that consciousness gap.
I think those were all the questions we have, right, Coral?
That's correct.
Okay, so let me ask you this question in our closing. And Coral, thank you for leading the conversation for the Q&A. So this last question I have for you, Ebony, is there a favorite quote or do you have final thoughts about equity that you would like to share with our viewers today? Or some advice?
Final thoughts or a quote. You know, I guess one quote that comes to mind, and it's a favorite one in our unit, you know, but James Baldwin, he says, not everything, and I think it goes with the question that Coral just presented, right? Particularly those last two. So James Baldwin talks about not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced, right? And so these are things that we can't shy away from, that we lean into, because you know, the one thing that's for sure is that if we don't seek to get the buy-in, if we don't have these very necessary, though difficult conversations, that we can't move that from you know, just conversation to new realities. And we, when you know better, you can do better. And so some of this is just in the process of us providing grace and space for each other to know and grow, but then to hold each other accountable for that next step beyond just the equity mindedness and the awareness, but to have the dispositions and fortitude to take action.
Well, Ebony, what you just said relates to this question that Samad Keys is kind of asking, and he's asking who needs to be at the table when attempting to implement this work. You know, having those conversations that you just mentioned, He also says, while much of the conversation speaks about leadership, how critical is it for other senior or not so senior leaders to be involved in implementing this type of work across the institution or system? So
Yeah.
who needs to be at the table?
Great questions.
Yeah.
And you know, you need a representation, you need representation across all
Mhm.
these different stakeholder groups. I know a lot of times when we do some of the coaching with various colleges, we require that they have someone from student affairs, student services side, right? Because oftentimes there'll be, you know, say a department head, there may be faculty, but that they're not necessarily incorporating student services, student affairs folks, or not bringing an IR or institutional effectiveness person to the table, or not bringing an industry partner to the
Mhm.
table. And so, to the extent that you can have those folk at the alongside what are again frontline in terms of early career staff and faculty, mid-level and C-suite, is that's who all needs to be at the table.
Mhm.
Because otherwise we end up with these silos and pockets whereby we can't necessarily build capacity in such a way where we can then scale up and then have transformative change, you know, beyond particular, you know, areas. So a great question, because I think that there are some partners that get untapped sometimes in terms of being co-curricular. They are indeed co-curricular partners in advancing the academic mission, even though they are not faculty, right? Or not necessarily on the academic affairs side of
Mhm.
the house. And it would behoove us to incorporate, as you said, a wider portion of who needs to be at the table. So that that way we can make sure that the processes and the practices and the policies that we have are equity minded,
Mhm.
in a more cohesive fashion across programming.
Well, Ebony, just thank you so much for joining us today, sharing your time with us, the viewers, and especially sharing how these equity briefs can be used at the college. And to our viewers today, thank you for joining us. We will follow up with you with an email and include a direct link to this webinar recording, the equity briefs that Ebony and her team created for the center, which also includes a spotlight series documents, and also the playbook that we released just recently. And you'll see that it's connected to that searchable database. So everybody, thank you. I hope you have a wonderful Veterans Day. And if you have any questions or comments, please contact the center. Ebony, what's the best way to contact you if anybody wants to have more dialogue with you about this?
Oh, sure. I can most readily be reached by email. My email is ezamanig, at illinois.edu.
All right, Ebony, thank you so much. And everybody, thank you. Have a great rest of the week.
You
All
too.
right.
Thanks, Linda. Bye
Thank
bye.
you. Bye bye.